Welcome, everyone. I'm Joni Cooper, Director of Programming for the DocLands Documentary Film Festival. Glad you could be here tonight. And I'm extremely pleased that the Director of Gather, Sanjay Raawal, is here with us tonight from New York. Thanks so much for coming, Sanjay.
Well, thanks to you, Joni, and thanks to all the folks that had a chance to watch this special sneak preview of Gather.
Yes, it's you're releasing on VOD the 1st of September, is that right?
Around the 10th.
Okay, so we'll remind people at the end how they can let other folks know how to see it. But all you folks out there, please take advantage of the Q&A button at the bottom of your window. You can fire us questions at any time, and we'll attempt to answer them for you. So some of you know that Sanjay took part in DocPitch last year, DocLands pitching forum, where typically the top voted project wins an audience choice prize of $25,000. And while Gather didn't win that prize, we'll actually never know if it did, because it had to be removed from competition. Instead, he gained an executive producer who was in the audience that day and who came with $30,000 instead. Sanjay, I think I frightened you a bit that day, just for a moment, when I said you were disqualified, before I launched in to tell you that you had actually won $30,000.
Oh, no, we weren't scared. You know, we're used to scoping out exits and getting our escape plan, so we were almost out the door.
Yeah, I noticed that. I apologize now. I think I apologized then, and I hope you've forgiven me for that.
I would have done the same thing.
It was just so incredible to see the excitement in the room and what went on. So I was quite pleased that it worked out that way for everybody in the end.
Yeah, well, for those who weren't there, right? There was 5 of us on stage pitching our own documentaries at different stages of development. And usually those pitches are, they're cutthroat, because, you know, the other documentary filmmakers either are or become your friends, but pretty soon you realize that only one team on stage is going to win. But at the end, you guys are kind enough to offer an award to everybody who'd come all the way out to San Rafael from, you know, like us, as far away as the East Coast. And some of us went home with the ability to finish our films.
Yeah, and you know what else I love about DocPitch? I mean, the camaraderie amongst the filmmakers is just so special. Like, nobody is, well, of course, everybody's a bit tense, but not for the reasons of, oh, they're gonna win, but just cheering each other on. I love that about DocPitch.
I mean, we all resigned to the fact that out of the 5 teams, 4 are not going to survive. So it's like gladiators, knowing that, you know, someone's going to die, and it might as well be you.
Yeah, although we also hope that through DocPitch, other people learn about the projects and come through in other ways.
Oh yeah, for sure.
So this year, I don't know if you know this, Sanjay, but this year, during these challenging times for filmmakers, our incredibly generous DocPitch supporters and sponsors have upped the ante. We will not only be awarding a $25,000 prize, but an industry award will also be awarding $100,000 in additional filmmaker grants among 8 pitching teams.
Wow, I was in the wrong year. Dang. No, we're grateful. We got an executive producer, a really close friend of the DocLands Film Festival and the California Film Institute, Christine Chance. And it wasn't $30,000 that she was able to offer. It was 50.
Right, 50.
So right now we have the record.
Yes, yes. I was remembering that incorrectly. But yeah, this year we're really thrilled to be able to help support filmmakers through these additional grants, because right now, as you are probably feeling as well, it's really quite a challenging time.
I mean, I'm in New York. Like I literally live on the ambulance route between two of the main Queens hospitals. At the same time, you know, our characters in Gather, they all live in Indian country. And Elsie Dubray lives on the Cheyenne River Lakota Reservation, which has state roads running through it. And the tribal council leader of her reservation actually put up roadblocks and checkpoints on those state roads, which are officially tribal territory. The governor of South Dakota, you know, screamed and yelled to no end. Our White Mountain Apache characters, Nephi Craig, and to the south, San Carlos. The White Mountain's effectively a COVID hotspot. It's kind of caught up to the Navajo reservation with the rate of infection. Oh. And for those who've seen the movie, it's like the resulting, you know, infection rates, not because of poverty. You know, that poverty has been caused by generations or decades of systemic racism and economic inequality. It's like the neighborhoods in New York City that got hit the most, you know, were the ones that had workers that had the lowest wages, had the poorest hospital infrastructure, had the most long-term health concerns from diet and access to food. And COVID for those communities just ends up being a hurricane of sorts. Yeah.
And of course, those underserved communities and the essential workers are taking so much of the impact of COVID. And as it turns out, you know, they're some of the most important people. And hopefully through all this, we'll come to really appreciate the work that they do.
I mean, in New York City as well, I'm kind of in a neighborhood that's in the heart of the protests. And it's, you know, it's a really phenomenal thing looking at how people are linking overall African-American lack of generational wealth to Reconstruction. And ultimately, you know, to the fact that the early American economy was solely land-based. It was completely agricultural. We didn't have oil discoveries until, you know, gold until the 1850s, you know, oil much later, the Industrial Revolution around the late 1880s. But everybody got their money from tobacco, from cotton, from timber, to some degree pelts. In addition to needing bodies to extract the wealth, you needed land. So the root of African-American human rights struggles and the root of Native American human rights struggles all began kind of around the same time, late 1500s, early 1600s, when the British colonists really developed this land-based extractive economy that spread. You know, as the topsoil was depleted in the East, the settlers spread that economy through Ohio, Indiana, and then across the Mississippi.
Now, you know, I've been thinking too, I wonder if, you know, how everybody around here in all the neighborhoods, they're starting to try to grow gardens and do all that. And I'm starting to think if we're beginning to understand that losing our food sovereignty through COVID and worrying about the availability of it. And I'm hoping that we do understand that a little bit more, but I am just so impressed with the characters in your film, the subjects, and the way that they have reclaimed that in a way and are trying to reclaim it. And I applaud you for bringing these stories out and helping them tell their stories, people who really haven't had a voice in a long time to talk about what really happened. And I think it's taken us a long time to realize what it meant in full terms about losing their land and losing their food.
I mean, colonization spread throughout the world, but the real battlefield for colonization and the doctrine of discovery, where the Pope in the 1500s basically granted permission to colonial powers to come and convert heathens. And, you know, in doing so, you know, bond them, you know, to take their land and commit unpardonable acts of cruelty. After the governmental incursion, there were corporations. You know, lots of American corporations were started in the quote West on stolen land. but Native Americans resisted all of that. Corporations and even the US military learned or developed its modern tactics through the asymmetrical warfare that it waged against Native Americans. I mean, you see it in the military, Apache helicopters, Black Hawk, Tomahawk, even when they say they're going in country out of the military base. Originally, in country stood for Indian country, like we're departing the reservation, we're going in country. So at the same time, Native Americans are still here. I mean, they're effectively the first resistance. They were the guinea pigs for a lot of corporate tactics, military tactics, government policy, and they can teach the rest of us who now see ourselves, at the tip of those same powers and facing the brunt of those same powers in different ways. Their tactics can teach us how to advocate for our rights. And when you say food systems, it wasn't until the 1920s or 1930s that the American grocery system really took power. And even in the 70s and 80s, there were some 70 or 80 major chains of supermarkets in the US, mostly buying local. Now there are 7 major chains that control almost 90% of our food economy. So when you say gardens, that's the way not just early Americans, but non-urban Americans lived through the 1930s, really, through the 1940s even. It was only after World War II that food became really, really cheap and that we could go to these gigantic outlets for that food. Before that, a lot of people were self-reliant.
And not only that, but I mean, look at the quality of food that was available too, as opposed to what they were actually growing and able to produce on their own.
Well, that sugar, salt, fat diet, that's a military diet. That's army rations, developed in the mid 1800s. And as the US military pushed west, it realized that by destroying native food systems, it could effectively subjugate natives. Why? Because those natives would be reliant on the US military for food. Now, those sugar, salt, fat food rations were only supposed to serve military soldiers for 1, 2, or 3 years. But those, quote, subjugated Native Americans were forced to live by these forts for 5, 10, 20 years or longer. And basically the people that developed those military rations saw how addictive that combination was. So again, the American industrialized food industry used Native Americans as early guinea pigs. They began noticing as well in the early 1900s high rates of diabetes in those Native American reservations in a way that they hadn't seen anywhere else in the world.
Right. Around this whole topic, we've got just a comment mostly about this from Deb Durant. She says, "Thank you for your wonderful film. Very enlightening. Most impactful moment. When the young man leading the group of teenagers talks about not having access to a grocery store, eating only at the gas station. This alone, shocking. If you expand the impact of this across the population."
When Native Americans were originally pushed from the East Coast and the Southeast to free lands, to Oklahoma, places where they were told they would never be disturbed or perturbed, they were expected by the US government to become farmers. And these were, hunters, gatherers, foragers, and farmers, but they were given the poorest quality farmland because in those days, white and immigrant settlers wanted the better land. And so natives got the worst land. In some cases, it turned out to be a boon, like for the Osage, their land ended up being, right on top of massive oil reserves. Right. But those parcels of land were as far away from municipal areas, urban areas as possible, as far away from railroads as possible. The highway system was built to parallel the railroad system. So Native American reservations by design are as far away from supply chains as possible. So you look at poverty there and you look at the fact that getting food there is more expensive than getting food anywhere else in the country. The only thing that exists are non-perishable fast foods, and the places that sell those are gas stations. So a lot of Indian country has these little tiny gas stations / bodegas, with hot dogs, with soda, with chips, incredibly easy to afford, cheap calories, but the health outcomes can be devastating.
Yeah, that's for sure. And that's definitely such a horrendous thing for the folks to have to live that way. Yeah. Yeah, I was especially impressed with your subject's restaurant opening and idea. Is it going well? Do you know?
Well, pretty much a month and a half after the restaurant had its soft open, COVID hit the White Mountain Apache Reservation.
Right.
And so they're all socially distancing. They're doing a lot of programs online, but obviously it's like, you know, the restaurant wasn't quite set up for takeout yet by then. And so it's not operational right now.
Oh, okay.
I mean, the restaurant's built and they're hoping that once everybody gets COVID under control, they'll be able to reopen. But we got there right at the nick of time.
Yeah. Yeah. I was wondering if they had been able to turn it around to do takeout like so many restaurants that we're seeing around. I'm really sorry to hear that that's not happening for them, but
you know, the other characters in the Apacheria, like Twyla, she's taking more and more kids out to learn how to forage. Obviously, you know, everything's socially distant. There's no school, but she's taking out, I believe, individuals, family members, giving them a real deep, you know, sense of where they come from. Clayton, who's got the farm, they're busier than ever because people are now realizing, as we all are, that health and immunity is tied to food. And so getting people fresh fruit and vegetables and other fresh produce has become, you know, a 24/7 job for him.
yeah. So he's been able to keep that all going and maintain the work on the farm.
At the same time, you know, the scary thing is that, you know, his farm relies on grant support, you know, the farm on the White Mountain Apache tribe. It's not quite to the level where it can be a working farm. At the same time, it's like people's habits have to change to go back to eating that traditionally healthy diet. And that doesn't come just with access. And
Right.
so he's got to spend the next few years educating people on the healthy benefits of, you know, spending a little bit more for that rather than spending a little bit less for gas station food.
Right. Actually, we've got a question from Judy Bergio around that same. She said, how has the healthier food been received on the reservations? Are people excited about it, or is it the fat, sugar, salt diet hard to move people off of?
That's a great question, Judy. I mean, as we know, we're all the same underneath the skin level. So it's like the addictive quality of that diet is as difficult on reservations as it is anywhere else. That said, you know, COVID has laid bare the extra effort that Native communities have to put into food sovereignty and doing the hard work of changing their palate and changing their children's palates, making these things more accessible, making these things more cool and more easy to access. So there's definitely been a renewed urgency for food sovereignty, particularly because, you know, the healthy food has an economic consequence. And they realize that if they can develop their own local food systems, then being at the end of the supply chain isn't going to create the same type of reliance on non-perishable food as it does now.
Yeah. Well, and that's certainly an advantage to being, you know, in the lower 48, because you think about the people up north, they're really being held captive because they can't grow their own. And I guess so many years of moving away from traditional foods takes a while to, if you try then to backtrack and back to being able to be in control of your food systems.
I mean, and those northern populations in Alaska, Canada, they've been so reliant on game and on seals, even on whales, on fishing populations that have been decimated by global warming. So they're coming from a place where they can rely on the land. They don't need the climate to be farm friendly. You know, they can live ancestrally pretty simply with the type of access to quote, products and animals from the land. But when those animals and products began disappearing because of climate change, because of pipelines, because of other industrial incursions that stopped the migration of caribou, for example, then it's like there's no choice other than to leave their ancestral lands to an urban area where food is maybe a little easier to come by.
Yeah, yes. I'm curious, Sanjay, how you came to this whole story, or did somebody come to you with it?
That's a great question. I mean, the very first very first film documentary was by a guy named Robert Flaherty called Nanook of the North. It was pretty much a staged film of reenactments. We call it now ethnographic filmmaking. There's some positive sides to ethnographic filmmaking, but from a modern lens, not really.
Yeah.
And as a result of that style of like outsiders coming in with technology, with wherewithal, with finances, most indigenous communities in the US, at least, of the generation that's now 40 or 50, kind of learned about Indians from films made by non-natives. So even as a person of color, coming from a background where my father, my guru, people that I hold dear were really affected by British colonization, through the 30s, 40s, and late 40s. I didn't dare, try to make this film. I didn't dare put myself out there. But through a couple of really unique conversations with a Native philanthropic group called the First Nations Development Institute, we kind of cobbled together what a film on food sovereignty would look like. And at the end of 6 or 7 months of just casual discussions and trying to just move the ball forward so somebody would make the film, they asked if I would do it. And of course, they said, we're much more wary and savvy to representation as natives than you ever will be. We appreciate your technical know-how, your storytelling ability, and we will help you to get access and to not make the mistakes that non-natives make in coming into Indian country. For example, there's a tendency to make everything really beautiful and to make things romantic, have that voice of God, like the shaman from above. And from the beginning, understanding the pitfalls and how natives really dislike that kind of ordinary portrayal. We put together a strategy just to find real characters, to treat them as experts, not to have any outsiders, even native professors as experts, to be as in the moment as possible. And the beauty was in the stories. And if we happened to be in great landscapes, well and good, but we weren't going to create Dances with Wolves or Revenant-like scenes. Not that we could have.
Yeah. Well, and that's what really appealed to me about the film is having everybody speak for themselves and bringing, just seeing their excitement and their interest and picking up on their energy and why they're excited about what they're doing. That's what I really loved about the film.
I mean, finding these characters was, a stroke of luck and very difficult at the same time. I mean, there's 300 some odd reservations, 500 plus tribal nations, and there's no way we could make a film about indigenous food sovereignty with a nationwide scope without getting seriously lucky or spending 5 years driving. And getting to Indian country is difficult for those. I'm assuming the majority of the viewers are in the Bay Area or in Sonoma or Napa. But to get to Eureka, you can fly. But I was on a flight from SFO to Eureka that got to Eureka and turned around in Eureka and went back to SFO because it was too foggy in Eureka. Or you can drive, and that's a 6 or 7 hour beautiful drive. So most places in Indian country, since they're not, most of the time, the places we went weren't near urban centers, it would take us a full day from anywhere in the US, sometimes longer, to get to the actual location.
Yeah.
So it was just really luck that we met the people that we did and that they opened themselves up to us.
Yeah, yeah. I sailed into Eureka at one point and spent time around that whole area. And so I was looking at the river, I forget the name of the river where he was fishing.
Oh, the Klamath.
The Klamath, yes. And just going back in my mind to how the area is, and gosh, it's a beautiful area. That whole area is just gorgeous.
And I grew up in Oakland, Berkeley, and obviously there's a lot of the reservation can't be accessed by non-natives, but where we filmed them camping out overnight was just 7 miles away from 101. And some of our camera people said they'd never actually gone on a camping trip that was so easy to get to a location, but at the same time, there were no garbage cans, there were no outhouses, there were no signs. You could be just a few miles away, 20 miles from Eureka or Arcata, and absolutely on your own.
Yeah, yeah. Deb Durant asks if you're familiar with Cafe Holocene in Berkeley.
Yeah, I heard they just closed because the bookstore that they were in was either forced to close because of COVID or had to, lost their rent. I mean, Vincent Medina is the head of Cafe Holocene, but he and his partner had a catering business. So hopefully, even though that indigenous cafe is probably no longer in existence, hopefully they'll still be able to do great work.
Right. Yeah, that's the scary part is there's just small restaurants, small stores just closing left and right around us. Jim Draper says, wonderful film, Sanjay.
Thanks, Jim.
He joined a bit late, but he said, how long was the film in production and how did you raise the funds to produce it?
So it was a pretty seamless process as far as films go. The Novo Foundation, Jennifer Buffett, is one of the largest donors to Indian country of any philanthropic body in the US. And their main food sovereignty partner is First Nations Development Institute. So the majority of funds came from them. And then about halfway through production, the 11th Hour Project came on really to complete the production budget. We got, sizable and important grants from Calliopeia, from, CFI donor Christine Shantz, from also San Rafael, Sausalito based foundation, Pantarea, from Ford, and a couple of smaller family foundations to piece everything together. The reason why we actually went over the initial budget was, we were waiting for our chef character, Nephi, to finish his cafe. And a lot of structural problems, just in terms of the fact that he doesn't own land. He doesn't technically have a lease on that property. It's tribal owned. And so he couldn't go to a bank and get a loan.
Oh.
The financial system for Native American entrepreneurs in Indian country is by design completely topsy-turvy. So it took him about a year longer to open that cafe than we had planned at the beginning. And so it was a struggle that last year to keep the production team going and keep the edit going while we waited for Nephi's cafe to actually finally open.
Yeah. Wow. I've certainly noticed in terms of the Black Lives Matters movement, and even where I am here in Canada too, the Native Americans and Native Canadians are kind of adopting each other and including them because they've been through such similar circumstances through the hundreds and hundreds of years. And I think what you talked about the economy being, so extractive, that everybody is having difficulty with gaining access to what their needs are in terms of access to not only to the food and that kind of thing, excuse me, but to like you said, to banking facilities and to loans and for everything that we as white people here take for granted.
I mean, the movements have always gone together, right? The first slaves in the New World were Native Americans. Columbus on Hispaniola decimated that population. The Spanish in Mexico and in the now current Southwest did the same. There were slaves brought in before 1619 into different parts of the New World. The British brought their first slaves in 1619 to the Jamestown colony. But as slaves began to escape, one of their first refuges was Florida. Florida wasn't one of the first 13 colonies. It was primarily native land, Seminole land. And the Seminoles and other tribes and the Creek, the Muskogee, protected runaway slaves, kept them safe. And of course there was intermarriage. A lot of the southern populations of natives, Mississippi, now Alabama, Georgia, there was a lot of intermixing and adoption of each other's cultures. So, you saw that kind of conjoining of movements with the civil rights fight in the 60s. There was a lot of native protesters with African-American protesters and vice versa. Well, you had, you had SNCC, you had the NAACP, you also had the American Indian movement, AIM. And so the kids use the word intersectionality, but like the oneness between movements has always been there to some level. I think it's just the rest of us that need to be educated that those two struggles are really the obverse and reverse of the same coin. For that agricultural economy, you needed land, you needed bodies in order to really take advantage of the economic situation you were in. The more land you had, the more bodies you had, the more money you had. And so the natives were the land. The native bodies weren't worth anything because they occupied the land. They needed to be moved or they needed to be killed. Africans later were brought in as foreigners to farm that land. And so the rights have always kind of encircled each other. They're not identical fights and struggles. They're not identical systemic struggles, but for those who've been there, the most racist places in the United States, and in my experience in Canada too, are the towns that border reservations or First People or Indigenous territory. You just would be shocked in this day and age to be in an environment like that. I mean, even Mendocino, when I was growing up in the early 80s, they had signs, and I didn't really even notice this until friends told me decades later. They had signs that said no Indians. Ukiah had sundowner laws that basically meant through the 80s, after 6 p.m., you could be arrested if you were Indian on the street for vagrancy. In California, the 13th Amendment didn't stop slavery. There was something that we referred to in the movie as the Act for the Government and Protection of Indians, one of the first things that the first legislature passed in 1850, that basically allowed people to kidnap whom they thought were vagrant natives on corners or walking around, and kids, and conscript them into bonded labor. That law wasn't completely stripped from California's books until 1920. So in effect, the 13th Amendment didn't end slavery in California. It was alive and well in California in a different format, not chattel slavery, but legally sanctioned bonded labor.
Yeah.
So there's a lot we have to learn and reckon with.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, that goes for almost anywhere too, that the enslavement didn't end because there were just other
now we know, and it's like those of us who are conscious can be good allies just by listening and just by using the powers that we have to help those movements push forward. We all know that without third parties, movements don't succeed. And as much as we hate to kind of accept that, I mean, the big change media-wise with BLM now is the fact that there's a lot of non-persons of color that are appearing at marches, and there are non-persons of color that are being injured by police brutality in those peaceful marches, and that's what's awakening the power structures and kind of creating an opening for those advocates and activists to really push this agenda and this movement forward.
Yeah, yeah. I tell you, I mean, it's a huge learning curve for us all, and I'm of course upset and angry, but I'm also a little bit excited, and I'm hoping that we will together be able to push the movement forward and help make amends. Oh my gosh.
I mean, it's nervous for those of us who are comfortable in the places that we are, because we know the world is going to change, but we just have to have faith that that new world is going to be better for all of us.
Yeah, and we know it will be. We know that. But yeah, like you say, it is uncomfortable, and all the learning that we've got to do, it's tremendous. It's tremendous. Do we have any more questions from anybody out there? Sanjay's here, obviously ready to answer them. And we mentioned early on that Gather is being released on VOD at the near the beginning of September.
Yeah.
And
Jason Momoa is our executive producer, so he's going to be, on the talk shows via Zoom, pushing it out there. And we have a couple of online platforms similar to this one that will allow people to screen the movie for organizations and to be able to hold group discussions afterwards. So, we're trying to hit it really hard. Indigenous Peoples Day is in October. Thanksgiving, of course, is in November. So we're hoping to continue the conversation all the way through planting season next year.
Right. And so you said any groups. So groups can contact you guys to set up a screening and go through that way.
Absolutely. We're on Instagram at Gather Film. Where our website is gather.film, a new URL combination. And we're also on Facebook. So, we'd love to hear from people, and love to hang out like this again, Joni. This is fun.
Yeah. We did get another question. They ask, it's anonymous, where do the various groups from Gather go from here? What plans do they have to further cultivate and share their knowledge with their communities? How can they do this given their hampered funding access and the devastation resulting from COVID?
Great question. Novo and the 11th Hour Project were incredibly generous to the First Nations Development Institute for them to plan what was going to be a 150 tribal nation tour of the movie. Indian country is also under-resourced in the sense that there's no bandwidth. There's no broadband, there's no Netflix, there's no streaming capability. So we're going old school. We're putting together large packets of DVDs that food sovereignty organizations in Indian country will self-distribute, socially distanced, with pamphlets, with ways for people to get resources, to seeds, to other ways that they can take control of their own food systems. Most local areas do have those types of resources, but outside Indian country, our role as a team is to try to draw as much attention to organizations in Indian country working on these issues, really using First Nations Development Institute as a conduit. Only 1 or 2% of all philanthropy in the US goes to Native-led organizations. It's almost nothing. And so if you slice that down and look at the Native food system, probably 0.5% of the entire national philanthropic capital goes to indigenous food systems. And so we're trying to change that just by raising awareness and letting foundations know that there's natives all over the continental US. There's tribes and tribal nations everywhere. And like you said, most are under-resourced, or if they're not, they could use partnerships, or they could use people understanding what policy issues they're tackling. Our director of photography, Renan Ozturk, whom Joni, has just released a couple of films about an expedition he made last year to Everest. He's a climber. We're working really diligently, all of us together, on getting this film out. And Renan has, as Joni, has been using his 1 million strong Instagram channel to do weekly conversations with the gathered cast. And those are lovely. Those are, 45 minutes long. They're on their tribal territory talking about what they're doing now and how they've been able to really, beat COVID, continue their work against COVID and use COVID as a wake-up call, if their communities even needed it as a wake-up call, to push some more food sovereignty projects through.
Yeah, yeah. Nancy Iverson would like to know what the link is for getting in touch. Now, you had said you're on Instagram, and I can actually type that in here, or you can type it in there, I think, can't you?
I will say, hang on a second. www.gather.film. Folks can email me at this address, or the film, which is, I'm also answering all those emails there.
Great, thank you. That's
Thanks,
super.
everyone.
Yeah, yeah. Speaking about Renan, when we're screening, we're going to be screening the DocLands films from this year, other than Gather, of course, which will be on VOD by then, but we'll be screening them in October in tandem with the Mill Valley Film Festival, October 8th to 18th. And we are going to be screening Renan's partner's film, From Carills with Love.
Oh, great.
The short film that they did together. So yeah, it just keeps going on and on. The filmmaking, it's just fabulous, the work that you guys have done, and in conjunction with Renan and Taylor.
And filmmakers are different. Some just like to make films and get them out there. But this film, we really started talking about it in the summer of 2016, started production in the winter of 2017. And, it's like you only have one opportunity to get a movie out. Once you miss that opportunity, nobody cares. Nobody cares about a 2018 or 2017 movie anymore. You try to make as big of a splash as you can and let those ripples take you through. So I'm grateful for this opportunity. This is our really, this is our first California screening. So
great.
Thank you.
Well, and that the Rafel at Home, the platform that we're on for this discussion, we've had more, well, I don't actually know how many, but we've done a few virtual theatrical premieres. And the filmmakers have really, really taken advantage of the platform and have released on, like you're doing, a number through a number of platforms at once, using great publicists and getting great reviews. And I think, it's just taking advantage of the situation to get the films out and getting them wider than they may normally get out on, after a festival.
Yeah, in this case, we have no choice. I mean, the thing that remains to be seen is how we'll be able to distribute DVDs in Indian country.
Yeah.
Obviously, we can't distribute 1 million, but we also don't want to just distribute 1,000. And so we kind of having to build an old school red box blockbuster Netflix DVD delivery service in Indian country. So if anybody's got any great ideas, on how to do that, make it effective, let us know.
Yeah, that's a great idea. Speaking of future endeavors, Sanjay, do you have anything in the books or anything that you'd like to direct?
I spent a lot of time during COVID just writing some scripts, writing some screenplays, writing out ideas that I've been thinking about for the last 2 years, but I've shelved them all in the last few weeks because our September launch date is coming up.
Yep, lots of work to do for that. Another question came in. What differences in food sovereignty issues are you aware of between Indigenous people in Canada compared with those depicted in the US, as shown in Gather?
I mean, that's a great question. I'm not an expert in Canadian First Peoples issues, but there is, first of all, the government has recognized the fact that there was a genocide and has said so much. The US government hasn't. But both populations are waging a severe uphill battle. You know, a lot of Canadian First Nations tribes rely more on hunting and gathering than contiguous United States tribes do. And, you know, there's border issues when it comes to migration of elk, caribou, of bison. At the same time, breeding grounds for salmon and the rivers in the Pacific Northwest have been decimated by dams and environmental tragedies like climate change. And so, you know, originally we were going to follow some Canadian First People that were north of British Columbia on a canoe voyage down to Vancouver Island. And in you know, just before we were able to really get that going, we met the Ancestral Guard in California. And we found that the issues that most of the salmon people on the Pacific coast faced were very, very, very similar. In the US, there's a lot more farming communities in Indian country than there are in Canada. Yeah. At the same time, though, you know, there has been, in both cases, a 400+ year history of military and economic devastation. Indians, kind of Native Americans, solemnly refer to their land as being reserved for their countries. It's supposed to be a reservation for them, but they realize that in one sense, in one morbid sense, they're holding them until the governments decide that they want them instead. And with that perspective, you see that there have been a lot of land grabs, resource grabs, mining issues, oil pipeline issues that have decimated food systems on both sides of the border. I mean, the Keystone XL pipeline comes from Canada. People talk about that as an energy project, as a land rights issue. But, you know, when the oil spills, it destroys food systems. It destroys river systems that people rely on for food. So all of those energy pipeline issues are food sovereignty issues. So in that sense, you know, people on both sides of the border are fighting very similar battles.
Yeah, and in the same sense too, originally when they moved in Canada, when they moved the native peoples off their ancestral lands, basically they moved them to places that were not great for growing crops at all.
Yeah.
So they lost there too. But yeah, hopefully see those, the hunting and gathering a little bit more is coming out. Yeah. Well, that's great. Sanjay, thank you very much for joining us tonight. Yeah, we'll have to do it again. As I mentioned earlier, we've got a plethora of prizes to award filmmakers during DocPitch this year. When it launches on August 13th, it's launching with an online conversation with the 8 pitching teams, and then viewing the pitches and project trailers and voting will all take place online. So more information on the whole process will be coming out on social channels and in your inbox very soon. I'm really excited about being able to do this. You know, had we not been able to do it online, then we may not have been able to provide the funding. So I'm really excited to do this. So that'll take place from August 13th until August 20th. And as I mentioned, DocLands will be presented in tandem with our big sister festival, the Mill Valley Film Festival, October 8th to 18th. And we will also be screening 2 other films, streaming, I should say, 2 other films that also took part in DocPitch last year. 5 Years North, the winner of the audience prize last year, directed by Chris Temple and Zach Ingrassi, and Socialism, an American story, that was directed by Yale Bridge, also ended up taking home funds donated from a private donor. So we're going to be streaming both those films, October 8th to 18th. And yeah, don't forget to keep up with all the programming that's taking place here on Raawal at Home. It's not only films being streamed, but there's live conversations. We'll be doing another live conversation next week with Jim Lebrecht and Nicole Noonan, who won the DocPitch in 2018 and took their project, Crypt Camp, straight to Netflix. So we'll have a conversation with them on Wednesday nights. Thank you, everybody, for joining us tonight. And I sure hope that this has whetted your appetites even more for documentaries. And we'll be seeing you all soon. Thanks, Sanjay.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Christine. I see you on. Thanks for making this film happen.
Thank you, indeed.